Wondering why it takes two anthropologists to respond to a ethnomusicology, it's because we're considered the semi-clueless. We are not, neither one of us is an ethnomusicologist, and we have learned a lot just being here. But Roberta, who can twist anybody to do anything, suggested that we could possibly contribute some anthropological things. One of the stories that Ruth omitted due to time that was in her original paper was one that really struck me profoundly. I want you to picture a conference such as this one. Many scholars in attendance. They're at Harvard. And Ruth is talking about the things that she's had up here, and she put the Cowper hymn, God Moves in Mysterious Ways, up on the screen. And during the question and answer period, suddenly one of the scholars leaped up. In fact, there's a librarian here. I wish I could have asked him to do this. Leapt up, and he said, "That was our anthem." Now, this is a 17th century hymn. But the emotional impact was incredible. Then I could also picture, and she showed you, so I didn't even have to picture it, we could see it. The women, Muslim and Christian women, together, dressed in white, walking through the streets of the city, praying, dancing, and singing, demanding that the war must cease. And as Ruth wrote, they did this daily until Charles Taylor relented and attended the talks, and a fragile peace was reached. Because the high-level talks were at a stalemate, the women took matters into their own hands, and they accomplished what the men were unable to do. Note that they didn't just do this once, as we here in the U.S. might do, but Ruth said they did it daily until Charles Taylor relented and attended the talks. Now, she doesn't tell us how many days daily encompassed, but it worked. So what's the missiological significance of such a powerful paper? To me, it's how we have undervalued the strength of women in missions. Several years ago, I had an Indonesian woman in our doctoral program at Biola. When I asked her what she hoped to gain from the program, she told me she'd earned her master's degree at another seminary in the States several years prior, but nothing that she had learned worked when she went back to Indonesia. With the same kind of tenacity expressed by the Capella women, she said she was at Biola to try again and see if she could find something that worked this time. Now, to a professor, this can be a daunting challenge. In the context of an experiential assignment for the class, she decided to use song to teach scripture. That assignment sparked the focus of her dissertation, in which she enlisted a group of 12 pastors to work toward putting the entire book of Matthew into song. In my naivete, and because I do not have any training in ethnomusicology, and I did not yet know Roberta King, I had no idea how difficult and risky this enterprise was. Since she was a prominent woman, being the wife of the president of the seminary, her status allowed her to approach these male pastors. Then she had to settle on a song form. Again, I had no idea how difficult this could be until I was teaching in Indonesia during her research. The students in my class sang a few different types of music for me so I could hear how different they were. Just as James Crable told us on Wednesday, there were a great many forms, and many of them were clearly inappropriate because they were associated with things like sex or spirits. Using one of the Machapat forms, the pastors worked to make sure that the text would fit into the song's meter without having to distort the message. She then tested it in rural villages where she felt the greatest need was. Her work became the basis of a course later taught at the seminary for pastors long after she'd gone to be with the Lord. Just as God used a group of passionate Capelli women to help change a toxic political situation, God used this small, frail Javanese woman to make the written word accessible to a culture where singing was the way that you communicated important things. The power of song, whether to help stop war, enable people to cope with tragedies like Ebola, or help pastors break out of the colonial model of the right way to teach Scripture, has been amply demonstrated through this conference. I'm not talking about giving women the kind of power that makes them believe that they alone are righting an injustice. I'm talking about not hampering the Spirit of God when it is entrusted to women who use it in God's strength, not theirs. As I read Ruth's paper, I was profoundly grateful that no missionary had been standing in the streets telling the Capelli women that they couldn't allow Muslim women to join them because they'd be yoked with unbelievers. In that situation, missionary absence was a blessing. Thank you, Ruth, for helping me, a cross-cultural educator, see how God uses women's voices in life-changing ways.
Okay, it's my turn for confession. I'm a complete amateur with reference to music and the arts. My field of specialization is social anthropology. In my first 15 years of my career, a professor of anthropology in the State University of New York, I ignored the church and was highly critical of missions and missionaries. After a mid-career recommitment to Christ and his mission, Judy and I began consulting with Wycliffe Bible translators and continued on that journey for the next 35 years. In all of that time, I have just been a participant observer of mission and the church globally. Now, I'd like to make a few observations then that are uninformed, unprofessional, and clearly an amateur, okay? We did our doctoral research on a little island in Micronesia called Yap. The Germans went there in 1910, and they found much in traditional arts, focused on architecture, tools, and the magical work of the spirits. By 1980, Yap was predominantly Catholic. Tin and cement replaced traditional architecture, and Budweiser, rock music, and guitars and TV were the common digest for people. Electricity had been brought there in the late 70s, and with that, television and so on. During our time there, we observed epic stories sung by elder women and dramatized in dances by young women or together with young men. But we never heard singing in the villages. The villages were quiet. I discovered in 1980, when I went back and did more research, that the young people would disappear into the mountains, and they would go out there with a case of Budweiser, and they would take guitars, and they would sing with the music they were hearing on the radio. And that's what I learned was really the way that the young people always sang. They sang in secret out of the villages were quiet. There were nothing in the villages that would lead us to have the kind of experience that Ruth has described. Furthermore, the church had music which was brought from their own traditions. And the church really ignored and rejected the narratives and dance songs that were typical of the traditional culture. So in looking at this, one Yapese pastor told me that we just have lost the opportunity to share the gospel in a medium that if we used it, the kids would be singing these songs as they went out into the hills around the villages. In looking at this, what I see as an anthropologist working with Wycliffe Bible translators over 35 years is mixed responses to Christianity and culture. For example, one of my first journeys with SIL was in Brazil. And during my time there back in the 1970s, I heard the stories of Bible translators out in village communities. In one community, the translator led a few men to the Lord and then left and went back to the Porto Velho, which was where they basically would work on language and translation without interruptions. And he got back to the village and found these new believers were singing at least 60 different songs that they'd created on their own. And they were enthusiastic about praising God because of their song was a part of their culture. In the particular culture that I went to and spent 2.5 months, I never heard one song. There was no singing. I saw that the only thing that they had that they carried over from a tradition which was really unknown was painting their faces and having amulets that they would use in reference to dealing with the spirits that they were afraid of all around them. And so in their world, the arts were very different from what we have been imagining and thinking about during our time here. As I reflected on James Cravill's 10 questions, these questions have provoked me to think about all these experiences that I've had in these different places. Another experience that I was reminded of was in Chad back in 1997. I took a young group of young people from Biola there to do drama evangelism. And one of the things that really was troubling to us is that 100 kids would gather every night around the fire next to where we were, and they would sing until 1 or 2 in the morning. And we couldn't sleep. And we realized that, hey, this is something going on here that's unique. I'd never heard this anywhere in the world that I'd been before. Kids singing late into the night. It was interesting also to see that when you would go to a church, there were always choirs. And the songs were much more like our brother did here on the marimba and the drum than the songs that we sing here in our gathering here. But it was, again, a culture in Africa as opposed to the island culture that we knew in Micronesia and how radically different they were. I also had an opportunity to work with SIL in Suriname in South America, and there I found in a village of people who were once slaves and who had fled into the interior and established a new world, a culture that was completely matrilineal, in which the women were really a key participant in every decision made. The only men that were important were their brothers. And when you had a funeral, the brothers basically worked with the sisters to organize the funeral. The women organized the music. The men organized the ritual divining that was essential to understand what caused the death. And so in that particular context, it was men and women working together over the grief of a death and how you deal with the death in that context. And similar to what we saw in the film, I saw young women in long lines singing and dancing as part of this funeral rite in that particular context. So my point in this is that cultures are incredibly diverse, and the expression of the arts around the world are incredibly different. And we cannot assume that because we have seen something here that it's going to be the same somewhere else. The most dramatic thing that happened to me is I did my doctoral research in this small island in Micronesia, and then the next trip I had, I went to the upper Amazon in Brazil. And that's where I discovered there was nothing ever relevant of anything that I'd seen in Micronesia in Brazil. It was a totally different world, a totally different understanding, a totally different language, totally different ritual, totally different understanding of the world and how people organized it. So I realized that I couldn't make assumptions from where I'd been before, that I had to start all over and learn again. Now, one of the things that I want to celebrate here is Professor Stone's exceptional ethnographic research. She has given us a beautiful picture of how sound and song plays such a significant role in Capelli cultural experience, and particularly around the events of trauma and death. I was so impressed with the musical performance that brought people together during the Ebola epidemic, and the role that this ancient song, "It Is Well With My Soul," played for them. That was a profound insight. But I also found that her quoting of this blacksmith about musical performance reflects clearly on how deep this runs in the cultural history of the Capel people. That the things that she saw were not new, they had been there for this long time. And the whole way that you deal with grief and with suffering and anguish was something that was deeply rooted long before they had a civil war and long before they had missionaries bringing these songs to them. And so as we reflect on this and look at it in terms of mission, what are its significances? I just have a few conclusions I would like to suggest. That we always are blinded by our own culture. And in Dr. Stone's report, the silence of death under the Ebola crisis is one example of that. Public health officials failed to comprehend the critical role of song and sound for death and funerals in the Ebola crisis. And so they were all forbidden. No one could be there. No one could do this. And they crushed the sounds of lament at death essential to the healing of families and communities, not intentionally, just out of their well-being and out of their desire to keep people from dying further. But they didn't really comprehend the necessity of song and lament on those particular occasions for the healing of the community. This should be a lesson to all of us. And I was reminded as I thought about the the stories that James Crable told us about Liberia on our first meeting, that we basically come with a culture and we tend to impose it, and we don't listen. And fortunately, William Wada Harris listened and understood that people did have songs and they did have a genre and they did know how to respond, and he gave them a permission to do it. And that's really something that I think is crucial for us. So I would conclude with this statement. God works in spite of the baggage and even the bondage of colonial mission. And I've looked at my own rejection of colonial mission when I began as an anthropologist, and I was very critical and very much against this kind of mission. But I realize that God worked in spite of the liabilities, in spite of the baggage. And as we look at this, we see the beauty of this black prophet in West Africa, Harris, being brought to Christ by African Americans who were repatriated slaves, but who brought the American church with them and used it to reach this man for Christ. And then he carried it on. And now we have this wonderful story of Liberia in this 21st century. And we see, again, the colonial church having a powerful impact and being part of God's work to help these people out of the roots of a culture in which they deal with tragedy and song, to bring both the Christian faith and ancient Christian hymns and contemporary things to the healing of people in that context. So thank you, Ruth, for that paper.
Mi